Stay with me, because what happened at that Manhattan Gala proved that a single moment of disrespect can cost more than $1 billion. The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Yet the instant Sophia Whitmore's hand brushed against Naomi Carter's face in front of hundreds of guests, an entire room seemed to stop breathing. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. A string quartet continued playing somewhere near the ballroom entrance. Waiters carrying silver trays froze mid-step. And for one long second, nobody moved. Naomi stood perfectly still beside a display of white roses imported from California's Napa Valley. Her dark emerald evening gown was elegant but understated, lacking the diamonds and luxury labels that filled the room. To most people attending the Whitmore Foundation Gala that night, she looked like someone important enough to be invited but not important enough to be noticed. That assumption would become the most expensive mistake in Whitmore family history. "You should learn where you belong," Sophia said, her voice carrying farther than she intended. A few nervous laughs followed. Others looked away. Nobody wanted to challenge the daughter of Richard Whitmore, the billionaire patriarch whose family name decorated half the skyline outside. Naomi slowly turned her head and looked at Sophia. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Just calm. The kind of calm that makes people uncomfortable. Around them, nearly 500 guests pretended not to watch while secretly watching every second. Politicians. Venture capitalists. Media executives. Professional athletes. Some of the most powerful people in America stood only a few feet away. Yet nobody stepped forward. Richard Whitmore emerged from a nearby group of investors, his custom tuxedo perfectly tailored, his silver hair immaculate beneath the ballroom lights. "What's happening here?" he asked. Sophia folded her arms. "Nothing, Dad. Just someone who wandered into the wrong section." Richard glanced at Naomi for less than 2 seconds before dismissing her entirely. "Security will handle it." Naomi said nothing. The silence unsettled him. Most people either apologized or argued when confronted by the Whitmores. This woman did neither. She simply looked around the ballroom as if she were studying something much larger than the insult itself. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, New York City glittered against the night sky. Inside, conversations slowly resumed. Champagne glasses clinked. Investors exchanged business cards. The gala's giant LED screen displayed a gold countdown clock. 10 minutes remained until the announcement everyone had been waiting for. Richard checked the screen and smiled. Tonight was supposed to save his company. Whitmore Holdings had spent 18 months negotiating a transformative investment deal worth $1 billion. Reporters had called it the financial event of the year. Analysts predicted it would double the company's valuation overnight. The identity of the lead investor remained secret. Only a handful of executives knew the truth. Richard was not one of them. Neither was Sophia. And standing beneath the glow of the chandeliers, with half the room quietly judging her, and the other half pretending she didn't exist, Naomi Carter glanced at the countdown clock, then at the Whitmore family. For the first time all evening she smiled. The smile lasted less than a second, but Brandon Whitmore saw it. Standing near the stage with a group of senior executives, he felt a strange knot tighten in his stomach. He could not explain why. He had spent years negotiating billion-dollar agreements, evaluating risks, and reading people across conference tables. Something about Naomi Carter felt wrong, not wrong in the sense that she did not belong there, but wrong in the sense that everyone else seemed dangerously confident about a situation they did not understand. Across the ballroom, Naomi accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and quietly thanked him. The young man blinked in surprise. Most guests treated staff as if they were invisible. Naomi spoke to him the same way she would speak to a business partner. The server smiled and walked away looking oddly encouraged. Richard Whitmore did not notice. He was too busy greeting investors and donors. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the giant countdown clock. Above the stage. 9 minutes. Then 8. Then 7. The mystery investor's arrival had become the only topic anyone wanted to discuss. Financial reporters clustered near the back of the ballroom. Analysts refreshed stock data on their phones. Even rival executives had purchased tables simply to witness history. If the investment closed tonight, Whitmore Holdings would secure enough capital to expand into 3 new markets within 18 months. Richard intended to celebrate before midnight. Meanwhile, whispers about Naomi began spreading through the room. A woman in a diamond necklace claimed she was probably an assistant who wandered into the wrong section. A hedge fund manager guessed she worked for event staff. Someone else suggested she was the guest of a guest. Every theory sounded confident. None of them were correct. Naomi remained near the rose display, occasionally glancing toward the stage, but otherwise appearing completely unconcerned. Then her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen and answered. The conversation lasted less than 20 seconds. Whatever was said caused her to nod once. "Thank you. I will be ready." She ended the call. A minute later the phone rang again. Another brief conversation. Then a third. Brandon noticed each one. He also noticed something else. Every time Naomi answered, she listened far more than she spoke. People who needed approval talked constantly. People who made decisions listened. 6 minutes remained. A silver-haired senator crossed the ballroom and stopped near Naomi. Several guests watched with confusion as the senator greeted her warmly. They exchanged a few words. The senator smiled. Naomi smiled back. Then he left. "Do you know her?" one donor quietly asked. "No idea," another replied. The uncertainty spread faster than gossip. Brandon checked his phone. There was still no confirmation regarding the investor's arrival. Strange. The investor's representatives had always been precise. Suddenly another figure approached Naomi. This time it was Daniel Mercer, the founder of a Fortune 500 logistics company. Richard had spent 2 years unsuccessfully trying to schedule a private meeting with him. Yet Mercer walked directly to Naomi and shook her hand. They spoke briefly. He laughed at something she said. Then he moved on. Brandon's pulse quickened. 5 minutes remained. Across the room Sophia continued entertaining friends, completely unaware that people had started glancing between her and Naomi. The earlier confrontation no longer looked amusing. It looked risky. Brandon excused himself from his group and began walking across the ballroom. Halfway there, Richard intercepted him. "Where are you going?" his father asked. "I want to talk to her." Richard frowned. "Why?" Brandon looked toward Naomi again. At that exact moment another phone call reached her. She answered, listened, and said only 6 words. "Tell them I have arrived." Then she ended the call. Brandon felt the knot in his stomach tighten even further. Richard followed his gaze and shook his head dismissively. "You are overthinking this." Perhaps he was. But as the giant clock above the stage changed from 5 minutes to 4, Brandon could not escape the feeling that the future of Whitmore Holdings was standing 20 feet away, and nobody in his family realized it yet. Richard Whitmore had built his reputation on certainty. For more than 30 years, certainty had made him wealthy. Certainty had helped him acquire competitors, outmaneuver rivals, and convince entire rooms to follow his lead. Yet, as the countdown clock continued ticking above the stage, he found himself watching a woman he had dismissed only minutes earlier. 4 minutes remained. The ballroom lights softened slightly as event staff prepared for the evening's headline presentation. A low hum of anticipation moved through the crowd. Conversations became shorter. Smiles became tighter. Everyone was waiting for the same thing. Everyone except Naomi Carter. She appeared completely at ease. A server passed by with a tray of sparkling water. Naomi accepted another glass and thanked him by name after reading the small badge on his jacket. The young man looked surprised again. Nearby guests noticed. Wealth often revealed itself in strange ways. Sometimes it was not the expensive watch or the luxury car. Sometimes it was the confidence to treat every person in a room with equal respect. Brandon could not stop observing her. 3 minutes and 40 seconds remained. He finally ignored his father's objections and moved closer. Not directly toward Naomi, but close enough to hear if another phone call arrived. Around him, Several investors were beginning to exchange puzzled looks. They had also noticed a parade of influential people greeting her throughout the evening. A senator, a Fortune 500 founder, 2 managing partners from major investment firms. None of it made sense if she was simply another guest. Then another small surprise appeared. An older woman in a navy suit crossed the ballroom carrying a leather portfolio. Brandon recognized her immediately. Catherine Doyle, one of the most respected corporate attorneys in the country. Her hourly rate was legendary. Her client list was even more impressive. Catherine approached Naomi and handed her the portfolio. "Everything is ready," she said. Naomi nodded. "Thank you, Catherine." That was all. No dramatic discussion. No explanation. Catherine simply smiled and walked away. Brandon's heartbeat accelerated. He knew enough about business to understand that people like Catherine Doyle did not spend Friday evenings delivering documents to random strangers. 3 minutes remained. Across the ballroom, Sophia finally noticed the shifting atmosphere. "Why is everyone staring at her?" she asked one of her friends. The friend shrugged. "I do not know." For the first time that evening, uncertainty entered Sophia's voice. Richard attempted to dismiss the feeling growing around the room. He checked his phone again. Still no direct message from the mystery investors team. That irritated him. Whitmore Holdings was the centerpiece of tonight's event. He expected better communication. Then his own phone rang. Richard immediately answered. "Richard Whitmore speaking." The call lasted less than 15 seconds. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for Brandon to notice. "What is it?" Brandon asked. Richard slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Nothing." But it was not nothing. The investors' advance team had arrived at the building. They were already inside. 2 minutes and 30 seconds remained. A ripple of excitement swept through the ballroom. Reporters adjusted camera equipment. Event organizers moved toward the stage. Security personnel discreetly positioned themselves near key entrances. Naomi glanced at the countdown clock. Then she looked toward the ballroom doors. Her expression never changed, but something about her posture did. She looked less like a guest and more like someone waiting for a scheduled meeting. Brandon followed her gaze. The massive doors remained closed. Yet somehow he knew she was expecting someone. Or perhaps something. 2 minutes remained. Richard forced a smile and began greeting donors again, determined to regain control of the narrative. But the room no longer belonged entirely to him. Too many people were watching Naomi now. Too many questions had formed. Too many details refused to fit together. Then, as the countdown reached 90 seconds, every phone in the ballroom seemed to light up at once. Notifications appeared. Messages arrived. Reporters checked their screens and suddenly looked stunned. Investors whispered to one another. A television producer nearly dropped her tablet. Brandon pulled out his own phone. One headline had just been released to select financial media outlets. The identity of Horizon Capital's founder would be revealed in less than 2 minutes. And according to the article, the person about to step onto that stage controlled enough assets to determine the future of entire corporations with a single signature. The headline spread across the ballroom faster than any announcement from the stage could have. People who had been casually checking messages suddenly straightened in their chairs. Reporters began whispering urgently into headsets. Several investors who had planned to leave early quietly returned to their tables. Whatever was about to happen had become much bigger than a routine investment presentation. Brandon read the article again. Then a third time. The details were limited, but one fact stood out. Horizon Capital was no longer being described as an emerging investment powerhouse. It was being described as one of the most influential private firms in North America. The founder's personal fortune alone exceeded several $billion. Brandon lowered his phone and looked across the room. Naomi remained exactly where she had been standing. Calm. Patient. Unhurried. As if the growing tension surrounding her had nothing to do with her at all. 90 seconds remained. The ballroom doors finally opened. Every conversation stopped. Two men in dark suits entered first, followed by three women carrying tablets and portfolios. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to operating around enormous wealth. Richard immediately assumed they belonged to Horizon Capital's executive team. He adjusted his jacket and prepared to greet them. Several photographers repositioned themselves near the stage. The evening was unfolding exactly as he had expected. Or so he believed. The group crossed the ballroom. Richard stepped forward with a practiced smile. "Welcome to the Whitmore Foundation Gala." The lead executive politely nodded but did not stop walking. Richard's smile faded slightly. The group continued forward. Past the stage. Past the donor tables. Past the television cameras. Straight toward Naomi Carter. A silence settled over the room. The lead executive reached Naomi and smiled warmly. "Good evening, Miss Carter. Everything is ready." Naomi nodded. "Excellent. Thank you, Michael." Several guests exchanged confused glances. One reporter lowered her camera and blinked. Another quickly began typing notes. Richard stared as the group formed around Naomi. Not protectively. Respectfully. The difference mattered. Brandon felt the knot in his stomach tighten again. 1 minute remained. Suddenly another notification appeared on phones throughout the ballroom. This time the headline included a photograph. A recent business magazine cover. Naomi Carter stood in front of a Manhattan skyline wearing a navy business suit. Beneath the image appeared a single caption. Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Horizon Capital. For a moment nobody reacted. It was as if the entire room needed time to process what they were seeing. Then the whispers began. They spread from table to table like a wave. Naomi Carter. Horizon Capital. Chief Executive Officer. Billionaire investor. Visionary entrepreneur. The woman many guests had ignored for the past hour was suddenly the most important person in the building. Richard felt the color drain from his face. Across the room, Sophia stared at her phone in disbelief. She looked up at Naomi. Then back at the article. Then up again. Reality refused to cooperate with her assumptions. 30 seconds remained. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and adjusted the microphone. The giant countdown clock continued its final descent. 25. 24. 23. Every eye in the ballroom shifted between the stage and Naomi. Cameras turned toward her. Reporters moved closer. Even the musicians had stopped playing. Brandon slowly exhaled. At last everything made sense. The phone calls. The influential visitors. The confidence. The calm. None of it had been accidental. Naomi had known exactly who she was from the moment she entered the ballroom. She had simply never felt the need to prove it. 10 seconds remained. Richard looked toward Naomi as though searching for some opportunity to undo the evening. Any opportunity. But opportunities had a habit of disappearing when people mistook respect for weakness. 5. 4. 3. 2. 1. The countdown reached 0. The ballroom lights dimmed. A spotlight illuminated the stage. Then the master of ceremonies smiled and spoke 7 words that changed the atmosphere forever. Please welcome Horizon Capital founder Naomi Carter. For a heartbeat the room forgot how to react. Naomi Carter rose from her place beside the rose display and began walking toward the stage. The sound of her heels against polished marble echoed through the silence. Every step seemed to rewrite the last hour. Every glance from the crowd carried a different emotion now. Confusion. Shock. Embarrassment. Regret. The same people who had overlooked her moments earlier now moved aside without being asked. The spotlight followed her across the ballroom. Richard Whitmore stood frozen near the front row. His expression remained controlled, but years of boardroom experience could not hide the tension gathering around his eyes. Sophia looked as though the floor beneath her had shifted. Her friends had stopped talking entirely. Nobody seemed certain where to look. Naomi climbed the stage steps with the confidence of someone who had spent her life entering rooms where people underestimated her. The master of ceremonies greeted her warmly and handed her the microphone. The audience rose in applause. Not polite applause. Real applause. The kind reserved for people whose reputation arrives before they do. Naomi thanked the audience with a small nod. Then she waited. The applause slowly faded. The ballroom became quiet once more. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was calm, clear, and steady. "Thank you for joining us tonight." Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Yet hundreds of people listened as though every word mattered. Because now they knew it did. Behind her, the giant screen displayed the Horizon Capital logo alongside statistics that drew immediate attention. $27 billion in managed assets. Investments across 3 continents. Partnerships with some of the largest companies in the world. Naomi continued speaking about innovation, long-term growth, and responsible leadership. She never rushed. She never raised her voice. Yet every sentence carried weight. Brandon listened carefully. The more she spoke, the more uncomfortable he became. Not because of anything she said. Because of what she did not say. She never mentioned the incident earlier in the evening. She never referenced Sophia. She never acknowledged Richard. She simply behaved as though the entire situation had been too small to deserve her attention. Somehow that felt worse. Then the presentation shifted. The giant screen displayed Whitmore Holdings. Financial charts appeared. Market projections. Expansion plans. Revenue forecasts. The audience leaned forward. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Naomi reviewed the company's strengths with professional objectivity. She highlighted opportunities. She praised certain strategic decisions. Richard felt hope returning. Perhaps everything could still be salvaged. Perhaps the earlier misunderstanding would simply disappear beneath the importance of the deal itself. Around the room, investors relaxed slightly. Reporters prepared headlines. Cameras remained focused on the stage. Naomi clicked a remote. Another slide appeared. This one carried a single title: Leadership and Corporate Culture. Richard's confidence weakened. Naomi remained composed. "Every investment decision we make begins with numbers," she said. "But it never ends there." The room grew quieter. "Financial performance matters. Innovation matters. Strategy matters. Yet none of those things matter if leadership fails the simplest test of character." Several executives exchanged uneasy looks. Naomi continued. "At Horizon Capital, we evaluate more than balance sheets. We evaluate judgment. We evaluate integrity. We evaluate how people treat others when they believe there is nothing to gain." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words settled over the ballroom like falling snow. Brandon slowly looked toward his father. Richard stared at the stage without blinking. Naomi clicked the remote once more. The screen behind her turned black. Then a short video appeared. Security footage from inside the ballroom earlier that evening. No audio. No commentary. Just a clear visual record of how certain guests had treated another guest before learning who she was. The room collectively held its breath. Naomi stood quietly beside the screen. She did not need to explain anything. The footage spoke for itself. And as hundreds of eyes shifted toward the Whitmore family, Richard finally understood that the most important decision of the night had not been made in a boardroom. It had been made long before anyone realized who was standing among them. The silence after the video ended felt heavier than any speech Naomi could have given. No music played. No glasses clinked. Even the reporters seemed reluctant to move. Hundreds of people had just witnessed the same truth at the same time. Not a rumor. Not an accusation. A simple record of choices made when certain people believed nobody important was watching. Naomi allowed the screen behind her to fade to black before speaking again. "Character is easy to advertise," she said. "Integrity is harder. Integrity appears when there is no advantage to showing it." Her words were calm, yet they landed with the force of undeniable reality. Across the ballroom, several investors lowered their eyes. Others looked directly at Richard Whitmore. For decades he had been one of the most respected business leaders in the room. Tonight that reputation suddenly felt fragile. Richard stepped forward from his table. The movement drew immediate attention. Cameras shifted toward him. He forced a smile that looked increasingly difficult to maintain. "Ms. Carter," he began, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." The statement hung awkwardly in the air. Naomi looked at him without hostility, without satisfaction, without anger. That somehow made the moment even more uncomfortable. "A misunderstanding?" she asked gently. Richard nodded. "The evening has been hectic. Emotions sometimes create unfortunate situations." Several guests exchanged glances. Brandon closed his eyes briefly. He knew his father was making a mistake. Naomi remained silent for a moment. Then she smiled politely. "Mr. Whitmore, successful organizations do not reveal themselves during perfect conditions. They reveal themselves during ordinary moments. That is why those moments matter." Richard had no immediate response. Around him, board members shifted nervously. A few had already begun checking messages from shareholders and analysts. News traveled quickly in financial circles. Reputation traveled even faster. Then another notification appeared across dozens of phones simultaneously. The room lit up with glowing screens. Reporters looked down first. Then investors. Then donors. One headline after another began appearing online. Questions about leadership. Questions about culture. Questions about the future of Whitmore Holdings. The market had not opened yet, but public opinion already had. Sophia stared at her own phone. Her confidence from earlier had vanished completely. For the first time all evening, she looked genuinely afraid. Not of Naomi. Of consequences. Brandon rose from his seat and walked toward the stage. Every step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the front, he looked up at Naomi. "May I say something?" he asked. Naomi nodded. Brandon turned toward the audience. "The responsibility is ours," he said quietly. "Not hers. We chose our actions. We chose our assumptions. Nobody forced those choices." The honesty surprised the room. It surprised Richard even more. Brandon continued. "I spent years learning about markets, competition, and growth. Tonight I learned something more valuable. A company can recover from financial mistakes. Recovering from failures of judgment is much harder." Naomi studied him carefully. For the first time that evening, genuine respect appeared in her expression. Not because he was powerful. Because he had accepted responsibility without excuses. The distinction mattered. The giant screen behind them changed once more. A final slide appeared. Horizon Capital Investment Review. The entire ballroom leaned forward. Everyone knew what came next. The billion-dollar decision. The future of Whitmore Holdings. The reason they had all gathered there in the first place. Naomi picked up a thin black folder from the podium and rested her hand on it. Reporters raised cameras. Investors held their breath. Richard watched as though the next few seconds might determine the course of his entire career. And in many ways they would. The black folder rested beneath Naomi's hand while hundreds of people waited for a decision that could reshape an entire corporation. Nobody checked their phones now. Nobody whispered. The room had reached that rare moment when uncertainty outweighed status, wealth, and influence. Naomi opened the folder slowly and removed several documents. The sound of paper turning seemed unusually loud in the silence. Richard Whitmore watched every movement. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. Numbers, negotiations, acquisitions, and market forecasts had always given him leverage. Tonight, none of those things mattered. The decision belonged entirely to someone he had failed to understand. Naomi glanced across the audience before speaking. 6 months ago, Horizon Capital began evaluating Whitmore Holdings. The giant screen displayed charts and reports. Revenue growth appeared first. Then expansion opportunities. Then market forecasts extending 5 years into the future. Several investors nodded. The fundamentals remained strong. Richard felt a small measure of relief. Naomi continued. Our analysts spent thousands of hours reviewing operations, leadership strategy, customer satisfaction, and long-term scalability. Another slide appeared. Strong ratings. Positive projections. Competitive advantages. The audience began exchanging hopeful looks. Some reporters quietly updated their drafts. Perhaps the investment would proceed after all. Perhaps tonight would become a lesson rather than a disaster. Then Naomi changed the slide. One word appeared across the massive screen. Trust. The room became still again. Most organizations believe capital is their most valuable resource, Naomi said. I disagree. Capital follows trust. It always has. It always will. Her voice remained calm. She was not delivering a punishment. She was explaining a principle. That difference became increasingly important. Brandon listened carefully. Deep down, he already sensed what was coming. Naomi walked slowly across the stage. A business relationship is not a transaction. It is a commitment. Investors trust leaders. Employees trust managers. Customers trust brands. Once trust begins to erode, every other metric eventually follows. Nobody looked away. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. He knew she was speaking about far more than a single evening. Naomi returned to the podium and lifted the final document from the folder. Cameras immediately focused on the page. Financial reporters leaned forward. This was it. The agreement. The billion-dollar decision. Naomi looked directly at Richard. Not with hostility. Not with triumph. Simply with honesty. Mr. Whitmore, your company has tremendous potential. Hope flickered across his face. Your employees are talented. Your strategy is ambitious. Your future could be extraordinary. Several board members visibly relaxed. Then Naomi finished the sentence. But Horizon Capital will not be proceeding with this investment. The words landed softly. Yet the effect was immediate. The room froze. Reporters stared at their screens. Investors exchanged stunned glances. A few donors quietly exhaled as though they had been holding their breath for minutes. Richard stood motionless. It was not anger that appeared first. It was disbelief. The possibility had existed, yet he had never truly believed it would happen. Naomi placed the document back inside the folder. This decision was finalized tonight. The statement carried enormous weight. Not because she sounded emotional. Because she sounded certain. Brandon closed his eyes briefly. Sophia stared at the floor. Around them, the consequences were already beginning. Phones vibrated with breaking news alerts. Analysts updated forecasts. Commentators prepared tomorrow's headlines. Yet Naomi showed no satisfaction. She had not come to destroy anyone. She had come to make a decision. There was a difference. She gathered the documents and prepared to leave the stage. Then she paused one final time. The strongest leaders understand a simple truth, she said. The way you treat people when you believe they have no power reveals exactly who you are. No one applauded. No one argued. The silence itself became the answer. The reaction did not happen all at once. It happened in layers. First came the silence. Then came the phones. Then came the realization. Throughout the ballroom, screens illuminated one after another as financial journalists published breaking updates. Reporters hurried toward exits to prepare live segments. Investors began speaking quietly among themselves. Nobody needed to guess what tomorrow's headlines would be. The story had already escaped the room. Richard Whitmore remained standing near the front table, staring at the stage long after Naomi had stepped away from the podium. For years he had believed influence could solve almost any problem. Tonight he was learning the limits of influence. Brandon looked around the ballroom and noticed something unexpected. People were not discussing the lost investment. They were discussing the reason behind it. That was the true damage. Numbers could be replaced. Capital could be raised elsewhere. Reputation was different. Reputation traveled farther and lasted longer. Naomi. descended the stage steps while members of her team gathered nearby. Several investors approached her immediately. One represented a major technology fund from California. Another managed a pension fund worth billions. A third oversaw international infrastructure projects. They were not asking why she had made her decision. They were asking whether she would be available for meetings next week. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Opportunity seemed to follow her wherever she walked. Across the ballroom, Sophia finally found the courage to move. She crossed the room slowly and stopped several feet from Naomi. The surrounding conversation softened. People noticed. Cameras noticed too. Sophia looked very different now than she had earlier in the evening. The certainty was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was a young woman confronting the consequences of assumptions she could no longer defend. "Ms. Carter," she said quietly. Naomi turned toward her. "Yes?" Sophia hesitated. For a moment it appeared she might walk away. Instead, she took a breath and continued. "I was wrong." The words sounded simple. Yet everyone knew how difficult they were. Naomi listened without interrupting. "I judged you before I knew anything about you," Sophia said. "And I treated you unfairly. There is no excuse for that." Several guests exchanged surprised glances. Public apologies were rare in rooms like this. Naomi studied her carefully. "What matters is what you learn from it," she replied. Sophia nodded. There was nothing else to say. No dramatic confrontation. No argument. No public humiliation. Just accountability. Brandon watched the exchange and felt something shift inside him. Throughout his career, he had measured success through quarterly reports and market performance. Tonight he was witnessing another kind of leadership. The kind that did not require anger to demonstrate strength. Meanwhile, board members from Whitmore Holdings had gathered around Richard. Their conversations grew increasingly urgent. Analysts would have questions. Shareholders would demand answers. The coming weeks would not be easy. Richard listened, but his attention kept drifting toward Naomi. Finally he approached her himself. The crowd instinctively parted. "Ms. Carter," he said. She looked at him. Richard seemed older than he had only an hour earlier. "I spent my entire career believing I could recognize value when I saw it." He paused. "Tonight proved otherwise." Naomi said nothing. Richard nodded slowly. "The investment is gone. I understand that. But perhaps the lesson should not be." For the first time all evening, Naomi smiled. Not because she had won. Because someone had finally understood. Around them, Manhattan glowed beyond the ballroom windows. Traffic flowed through the streets below. The city continued moving forward, indifferent to fortunes gained or lost. Naomi glanced toward the skyline and gathered her coat. The evening was over. The decision had been made. The consequences would unfold on their own. And as she walked toward the exit, accompanied by neither celebration nor applause, many people in that room realized the most powerful person there had never needed to prove it. She only needed to be herself. The cold night air outside the ballroom felt different from the atmosphere she had left behind. Naomi Carter stepped onto the sidewalk beneath the glow of Manhattan's skyline, while traffic rolled steadily through the city that never paused for anyone. Behind her, the gala continued, but its energy had changed. The conversations were no longer about expansion plans or billion-dollar projections. They were about choices. The kind people make when they believe no one important is paying attention. A black sedan waited at the curb. One member of Naomi's team opened the rear door, but she did not get inside immediately. Instead, she looked up at the towers surrounding her. Glass. Steel. Light. Every building represented thousands of decisions made over decades. Some good. Some bad. Some forgotten. Her phone vibrated. Then again. And again. Messages from investors. Executives. Journalists. Requests for interviews. Requests for meetings. Requests for partnerships. Naomi silenced the device and slipped it into her purse. Certain moments deserved quiet. Across town, the story was already spreading. Morning news producers were rewriting segments. Financial commentators were preparing analyses. Social media feeds filled with discussions about leadership, accountability, and respect. Yet the most surprising reaction came from ordinary people. Restaurant servers, receptionists, security guards, administrative assistants, employees who spent years feeling invisible. They were not talking about the investment. They were talking about something simpler. The idea that every person deserved dignity before their status became known. Inside the ballroom, Brandon Whitmore remained near the stage long after most guests had returned to their tables. He watched employees clear glasses and fold linens. For the first time, he noticed details he had overlooked hundreds of times before. The staff worked efficiently, professionally, and quietly. They always had. The difference was that tonight he was paying attention. One of the servers passed nearby. Brandon stopped him. "Thank you for your work tonight," he said. The young man looked surprised, then smiled. It was a small moment. Nobody applauded. Nobody recorded it. Yet sometimes change begins in ways too small to make headlines. Richard Whitmore stood near the ballroom windows, looking out over the city. His company would face challenges ahead. Difficult meetings. Difficult questions. Difficult decisions. But for perhaps the first time in many years, he was thinking less about quarterly earnings and more about personal responsibility. Wealth had protected him from many consequences. It had not protected him from truth. Sophia left the gala through a side exit and walked several blocks before calling a car. She needed time to think. The evening had taken something from her pride, but it had given her something more valuable in return. Perspective. She could not change what had happened. She could choose who she became afterward. Meanwhile, Naomi finally entered the waiting sedan. The door closed softly. The city lights reflected against the window beside her. One of her advisors turned and asked the question everyone else wanted answered. "Do you regret it?" Naomi smiled. "Regret what?" "Walking away from the deal." She looked back toward the distant glow of the ballroom. "No." The advisor waited. Naomi folded her hands and spoke quietly. "Money can build companies. Character determines whether they deserve to last." The car pulled away from the curb and merged into the flow of traffic. Within minutes, the gala disappeared behind them. The city moved forward. The night moved forward. Life moved forward. Yet the lesson remained. Not because a billionaire lost an opportunity. Not because a corporation lost an investment. But because an entire room learned that respect should never depend on a title, a bank account, or a name printed on a magazine cover.